What just happened inside the WNBA isn't being talked about honestly, and the silence around it is deafening. Stephen A. Smith didn't just give another hot take or headline-grabbing rant, he confirmed a reality that the league has been desperately trying to hide. A reality that changes everything about where women's basketball is headed next. Because this isn't about contracts, pay raises, or typical labor negotiations. This is about power, leverage, and what happens when the one person driving the entire machine quietly decides she doesn't need to be in the driver's seat anymore. For months, we were told the WNBA was thriving like never before. Ratings were skyrocketing, arenas were packed, sponsors were flooding in, and charter flights finally became reality. The narrative was simple. Women's basketball had arrived, and nothing could stop this momentum. But what if that momentum was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit? Stephen A. essentially dropped a reality bomb that exposed an uncomfortable truth. The league's explosive growth wasn't evenly distributed across the board. It was centered around one gravitational force. And when that force stopped engaging the way it used to, panic followed. There was no resignation letter, no emotional goodbye speech. Instead, there was something far more calculated: distance, silence, and decisions that sent shockwaves through the entire organization. This video breaks down the crisis unfolding behind closed doors in the WNBA, a crisis that could reshape the future of women's professional basketball. We're going to walk through exactly how the Players Union made a catastrophic miscalculation, why Caitlin Clark's quiet withdrawal is more dangerous than any public feud, and what happens when a league's entire economic engine realizes it has all the leverage. Stephen A. Smith laid out the pieces, but most people missed how they all connect. By the end of this video, you'll understand why executives are panicking, why the union's strategy backfired, and why one player's silence is louder than any negotiation demand. The story starts with a decision insiders are calling a complete crash out. The WNBA Players Association opted out of their collective bargaining agreement 2 years early, believing they had maximum leverage. They looked at record attendance, exploding ratings, and new sponsorship deals, and assumed the league had no choice but to give them what they wanted. But they made one fatal assumption: that the machine could run without its engine. They assumed fans were now loyal to the product itself. The viewership would stay strong regardless of who was on the court. What they didn't account for was that one person could quietly step back, and the entire foundation would start cracking. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Before we go further, if you're finding this breakdown valuable, do me a favor. Smash that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts on this situation, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. This story is far from over, and you'll want to stay ahead of the narrative. Now let's dive into the decision that started this downward spiral. The WNBA Players Association didn't just opt out of their collective bargaining agreement quietly or cautiously. They did it boldly, confidently, and 2 full years ahead of schedule. On the surface, this looked like strength and perfect timing. After all, the league had never looked stronger on paper. Attendance numbers were exploding. Television ratings were breaking records. Corporate sponsors were finally taking the product seriously, and private charter flights had become reality after decades of fighting. To the union, this seemed like the perfect storm, the moment where they could finally demand what they believed they deserved. But Stephen A. Smith pointed out the critical flaw that almost nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud. The league was acting rich before it was actually rich. Yes, growth was real, but profitability was still new, fragile, and heavily dependent on momentum, continuing without interruption. The players weren't negotiating with a long-established cash machine. They were negotiating with a business that had only recently started seeing daylight. And here's where the miscalculation became truly dangerous. The union didn't just opt out quietly. They did it loudly and publicly, with messaging that suggested they believed the league had no choice but to bend. They believed fans were now loyal to the WNBA itself, that viewership would remain strong no matter what happened. But that surge in attention didn't come from nowhere, and it wasn't evenly spread across all teams. It was driven by one phenomenon, pulling casual fans into the sport for the first time. And the union chose to escalate pressure while simultaneously creating an environment that pushed that very phenomenon toward the exit. This is where Stephen A. Smith stopped speculating and started speaking with the certainty of someone who's watched this exact scenario play out before in professional sports. He didn't frame his comments like gossip or hot takes. He spoke with the tone of someone who already knew how this story would end and felt obligated to say it out loud before everyone pretended to be shocked later. Because when Stephen A. talks about leverage in sports, he's not guessing. He's watched leagues rise and fall, stars save entire organizations, and he's watched decision-makers make the fatal mistake of believing they were bigger than the individual carrying the entire product on their back. What made his commentary hit so much harder wasn't the volume or the drama, it was the certainty behind it. Stephen A. wasn't debating whether Caitlin Clark could walk away from the WNBA. He was explaining why she essentially already had, just not in the way people expected. No dramatic exit announcement, no angry press conference, no social media meltdown. Instead, he described something far more devastating for the league: a soft resignation, a calculated withdrawal from an ecosystem that no longer served her interests. And that distinction matters more than anything else, because in every labor dispute, there's a hierarchy of pain. Players who need their paychecks suffer first when games stop. The league suffers next when revenue disappears. But stars with independent wealth, massive brand power, and endless options outside the system, they're insulated. They can wait, they can pivot, and they can walk away without losing anything. Stephen A. made it brutally clear that Caitlin Clark exists completely outside the traditional power structure of the WNBA, and that changes absolutely everything about how this negotiation will unfold. This is the moment that turned private anxiety into full-blown panic, even though most fans barely noticed it when it happened. Because on the surface, Caitlin Clark turning down an offer from Unrivaled, the new 3-on-3 women's basketball league, doesn't sound earth-shattering. Players decline opportunities all the time for scheduling conflicts, rest, or other priorities. That's the easy explanation everyone wanted to believe. But Stephen A. Smith made it crystal clear this wasn't just any offer. This was the offer. Unrivaled wasn't built as some casual passion project. It was engineered as a pressure valve for the WNBA, a way to keep star players visible, profitable, and marketable during the offseason, without losing them to overseas leagues. And most importantly, it absolutely needed Caitlin Clark. Insiders believed her participation would legitimize the entire league overnight. Television negotiations were hinging on it. Sponsorship projections were modeled around her involvement, and media partners were waiting to see if her name would be attached before committing serious money. So when Clark was approached, the pitch wasn't subtle. The reported offer checked every box a player could dream about: short commitment, massive payday, ownership equity, creative control, and red carpet treatment. For most players, grinding year-round just to stay financially afloat, this would have been automatic. But for Caitlin Clark, it was something else entirely. Stephen A. framed her rejection as the clearest signal yet that she was distancing herself not just from one league, but from the entire internal power structure of women's basketball. She didn't need to explain herself publicly. The decision explained everything. Instead of chasing more exposure, she chose absence. Instead of reinforcing their leverage, she removed it. And that forced everyone involved to confront a terrifying question. What if Caitlin Clark doesn't need any of this anymore? This is where Stephen A. Smith stopped being polite and started being painfully honest, because at this point, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. He framed the entire situation with one analogy that instantly cut through all the noise: the golden goose. And once you understand that metaphor, everything about the WNBA's current crisis becomes disturbingly clear. Caitlin Clark isn't just another player, another rookie, or another high scorer. She is the economic engine driving unprecedented attention into a league that had been fighting for relevance for nearly 3 decades. And yet, instead of protecting that engine, the system around her has been doing something far more self-destructive. They've been pecking at it. Stephen A. pointed out the hypocrisy with brutal clarity. On one hand, players and union voices are demanding revenue sharing, equity, and recognition tied to the explosion of interest in the league. On the other hand, those same voices minimize, dismiss, or outright resent the very player responsible for that explosion. You can't have it both ways. You can't demand Caitlin Clark money while treating Caitlin Clark like an inconvenience. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight all season. Hard fouls that cross the line from physical to personal, cold shoulders in locker rooms, subtle dismissals in media appearances, and exclusion from opportunities that should reflect, merit, and impact. Stephen A. didn't dance around it. He called it what it looked like: jealousy mixed with denial. Not jealousy of her talent, but jealousy of her gravity. Because Clark didn't just raise her own profile, she raised ticket prices, television ratings, sponsorship value, and the visibility of players who had been grinding in relative obscurity for years. And instead of embracing that reality, parts of the ecosystem reacted defensively, trying to squeeze golden eggs out of the goose while simultaneously preparing it for dinner. This is where Stephen A. Smith completely removed emotion from the conversation and replaced it with something far more unforgiving: math. Because feelings can be debated and narratives can be spun, but numbers don't care who's offended. Stephen A. made one thing brutally clear: the WNBA Players Association is negotiating as if everyone in the league is equally dependent on the outcome. And that assumption collapses the moment Caitlin Clark enters the equation. The average WNBA player needs this collective bargaining agreement raise. They need higher salaries, better benefits, and financial security, so they don't have to fly overseas every offseason just to survive. That reality is legitimate, and Stephen A. didn't dismiss it. But Caitlin Clark doesn't live in that reality. Her WNBA salary, even with bonuses and increases, represents a microscopic fraction of her annual income. It's symbolic, not structural. Stephen A. broke this down with uncomfortable clarity. Nike deals, major beverage brands, insurance commercials, global sponsorships, merchandise sales that dwarf most team revenues. Clark's financial ecosystem exists completely outside the league. In a lockout scenario, the pain isn't shared equally. When games stop, most players lose their primary income stream. Caitlin Clark doesn't. If the season stalls, endorsement checks still clear. If negotiations drag on, brand campaigns still run. If the league shuts down entirely, her relevance doesn't disappear. That makes her the only player in the league who can walk away from the negotiating table without flinching. And that reality fundamentally breaks the union's bargaining position. They're threatening disruption in a system where the most valuable piece is completely immune to disruption. That's not leverage. That's self-sabotage. And the union is demanding a bigger slice of a pie that only exists at its current size because of the one person they refuse to fully embrace. This is where Stephen A. Smith stopped aiming at the players and turned his fire directly toward the top, because in his eyes, the biggest failure didn't belong to the union or the veterans. It belonged to leadership. In any serious business, there is one non-negotiable rule: you protect the asset that generates the revenue, not emotionally, not politically, but structurally. Stephen A. argued that WNBA leadership violated that rule at every possible level. They watched the tension build, heard the whispers, saw the hostility forming in real time, and they did nothing. Instead of stepping in early and setting clear boundaries, they allowed resentment narratives to spread like wildfire. They allowed on-court aggression to blur into something personal. They allowed media framing to turn Caitlin Clark into a lightning rod rather than a league ambassador. Stephen A. compared it to a company watching its top salesperson generate 80% of revenue while coworkers openly undermine them and management just shrugs. That's not neutrality. That's negligence. The league had a once-in-a-generation opportunity to stabilize, grow, and professionalize its product at warp speed. Clark's arrival wasn't just a basketball moment. It was a business inflection point. And instead of insulating her from internal friction, leadership let her absorb it. No public messaging, reinforcing her value. No internal standards about treatment. No clear acknowledgement of the financial reality. Just silence. And silence from leadership is never neutral. It's permission. Permission for resentment to grow. Permission for lines to be crossed. Permission for the environment to become hostile. The leadership didn't want to be accused of favoritism or face backlash, so they chose inaction. And that inaction allowed the situation to rot from the inside out, pushing their most valuable player toward complete emotional detachment. This is the part of the conversation that makes executives shift uncomfortably in their chairs, because once it enters the picture, all domestic leverage disappears completely. Stephen A. Smith didn't spell it out dramatically because he didn't need to. Anyone who understands modern sports economics already knows the truth. Caitlin Clark isn't just a WNBA player anymore. She's a global asset, and globalization changes everything. For decades, overseas basketball was treated as a fallback, a place players went out of necessity, not choice. Long seasons, grueling travel, physical wear, cultural adjustments. It was survival money, not leverage money. That's no longer the case. Stephen A. hinted at what insiders have been whispering for months. International markets are watching Caitlin Clark very closely. European clubs, Asian exhibition circuits, global sponsors looking for crossover stars who can sell out arenas for one-night events, not full seasons or long-term contracts, just high-profile appearances. And the money attached to those appearances is staggering. Stephen A. framed it as a nightmare scenario for the WNBA because if the league enters a lockout, Clark doesn't lose opportunity. She gains flexibility. She could play limited games, tour major cities, and make more in a month than the average WNBA player earns in years. London, Paris, Tokyo, Shanghai. The Caitlin Clark Global Tour isn't fantasy. It's a viable business model. And that's what truly terrifies the union's entire strategy. The moment Clark steps outside the WNBA ecosystem, the league loses control of her narrative, her availability, and her value. This is the mistake being made in real time, treating the WNBA as the only platform that matters. That was true once. It isn't anymore. The league used to be the gateway. Now, it's just one option among many. And when a star realizes that, the power dynamic flips completely. This is where Stephen A. Smith stopped framing the situation as a debate and started framing it as an inevitability. Because once all the pieces are on the board, the outcome becomes obvious. The union escalated, leadership hesitated, the ecosystem fractured, and Caitlin Clark went quiet. Stephen A. made it clear that silence in this context isn't uncertainty. It's leverage. It's the most powerful position anyone can hold in a system addicted to attention. Clark doesn't need to threaten departure, hint at retirement, or demand concessions. All she has to do is nothing. Every week she stays disengaged. The pressure compounds. Every opportunity she declines. The imbalance becomes clearer. Every moment she remains relevant without stepping on a WNBA court proves the same uncomfortable truth. The league needs her far more than she needs the league. Stephen A. described it as checkmate without a final move because there's no counterplay available that doesn't involve massive risk. If the league pushes harder, it risks alienating her permanently. If it backs off too much, it exposes how dependent it truly is. The union is trapped by urgency. Leadership is trapped by optics. Media partners are trapped by uncertainty. Caitlin Clark isn't trapped at all. This situation may never end with a formal resignation or emotional goodbye. It may end exactly the way it's unfolding now, quietly. A missed off-season appearance here, a reduced schedule there, a longer break than expected, a gradual shift toward other platforms. And suddenly, the league wakes up one day and realizes the center of gravity has moved. Not because Caitlin Clark was pushed out, but because she chose peace over pressure. The eject button doesn't need to be slammed dramatically. Sometimes it's pressed gently. And the scariest part for the WNBA? Clark has already shown she can press it without losing anything. So here's the reality. This isn't just a labor dispute. This is a test of whether the WNBA understands the moment it's living in. Stars like Caitlin Clark don't threaten systems. They outgrow them. If you want to understand what happens next before the headlines spin it and before the truth gets softened, you need to stay right here. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think happens next, and subscribe because when this story moves again, it won't be loud. But you'll want to be the first to know this is far from over.